Hello, I am your host, Nick Moore, and today we will be talking about two fantastic books, In Cold Blood by Truman Capote and Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. So what's the common topic between these two works? Well, Crime and Punishment and In Cold Blood both talk about murders, and with these murders come consequences. So what's the common theme? In Crime and Punishment, it's pretty obvious, as it's called Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov, his guilt was his punishment after he killed those two women. His guilt haunted him for his whole life until he turned himself in. In Cold Blood, their punishment was their execution. There's also hope in both of these. Hope is a pretty prevalent theme in Crime and Punishment because Raskolnikov is hoping for a better life as he murders the woman, and he's hoping for a better life as he's dealing with the guilt after he killed the woman. And in Cold Blood, there's also hope as Dick and Perry both hope for a better life, and that's why they went to go rob the Clutters, ultimately murdering the whole family. There's also poverty in both. Rick and Perry are very poor, and they've been poor their whole lives. So this poverty makes them do crazy things like commit a murder, just like Raskolnikov. He felt he had no other way to turn besides murder that woman. And that's what is a driving force for some people, and that goes to the Marxist lens, especially in Crime and Punishment, as to why people, especially Raskolnikov and Dick and Perry, murdered those people, because poverty was a big reason. Family is also a big reason, big theme in both of these. Family for Raskolnikov, he felt very disconnected from his mother and his sister. He did not feel like he was a part of the family, so he was on his own quite a lot. As a young kid who still was trying to study law. And family was also a very big part in Cold Blood because Perry, his upbringing was not very good, and that exemplifies the purpose of Capote's work in Cold Blood. He made this to shed light on the fact that people are not naturally or born evil. It's their upbringing or their family, which is the common theme that they share, that leads them to making these bad decisions and turning them ultimately. The difference in the themes of these two works is guilt. Guilt haunts Raskolnikov the whole time after he killed the woman. And we could see this as he uses repeated words like delirium. After he killed that woman, he is in constant delirium, and he can never be himself again until he turns himself in. That's the main difference. Dick and Perry, they don't feel any guilt, so they're fine. They don't feel any different after they killed the Clutters because it's just like any other family they've killed or people they've killed. The main difference is guilt. And if I had to pick a viewpoint, I would go with that of Crime and Punishment, because it's just how I would react. I would feel so guilty if it was an accident or not, if I killed someone. And that's just the normal moral reaction to killing someone, taking another life, is guilt. You can see how the theme connects with diction. As I mentioned before, delirium. Delirium was used to show the guilt that Raskolnikov had after murdering those two women. It's to show he's in a constant haze, and this word is constantly repeated after he committed these murders. It's to show his guilt and his overall remorse for what he's done. It literally means acutely disturbed state of mind, and this is literally what Raskolnikov feels after the murder, and the actual connotation of this is negative, which exemplifies how he is struggling internally, which is a man versus self conflict. Raskolnikov is constantly in a man versus self conflict. we look at the phrase fallen upon him, the denotation means something literally fell on Raskolnikov. But if we look at the connotation, which is negative, we can see that this is something eerie and a force that came on him. It wasn't his fault. It was a random force that came on him and made him feel this solitude. This is why the author chooses to say wrapped him. It wasn't his fault. This solitude came around him and wrapped him up, holding him and covered him up in solitude. The word dreary means lifeless and dull, and the connotation is quite similar, as it is negative, showing how lost Raskolnikov is in his own head. And this again shows his man versus self conflict. So if we look at the word feebler, this literally means lacking strength, and the connotation is very negative, showing how detrimental this was for Raskolnikov. He actually lost strength instantly because he felt so much guilt. This shows his man versus self conflict. Again, they hammer that home using diction, and this shows the author's voice and a theme of guilt. The author's voice is the man versus self, and how detrimental guilt can be to your soul, and you just feel depressed constantly. You're in constant delirium, going back to delirium. The author did this to show how Raskolnikov is controlled physically and mentally by his guilt. The phrase agreed in his heart shows how this was an internal battle for Raskolnikov, and he needed to have the courage to will himself to make a change by doing the right thing. And this goes back again to hope. His hope was the only thing keeping him going. He hoped for a better life free of guilt, and by confessing, he would have a better life. The author included this to show how this is chiefly Raskolnikov's choice, and he had the power to make this change. Using the diction that I just talked about, it just shows how Raskolnikov was constantly in a state of guilt and man versus self conflicts. And this just went to show the author's intended audience, and that was people of Russia who were living in this corrupt society and those who were suffering themselves. Raskolnikov is suffering internally due to Russian corrupt society, and Dostoevsky wanted to shed light on the problems in Russia for people who are also going through those problems, and for people who could make the change to make Russian society better, so there wouldn't be problems suffered from those who were constantly suffering, like Raskolnikov and Sonia. We look at this quote literally. You can see how Mr. Clutter's farm was a very beautiful and pure place that he found very safe and protected. Looking at this through a connotation, you can see that the connotation is very positive, showing that this farm is a sanctuary for Mr. Clutter and his family. This shows the voice of the author about how such a beautiful place can be destroyed by such sin entering this paradise. The author uses imagery to convey this. This is an allusion to the Bible and also a metaphor comparing the farm to the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden was the farm, the beautiful place, very safe for the Clutters. Clutters were like Adam and Eve. The sin entering was the devil offering Adam and Eve the apple, and the sin was Perry and Dick coming and murdering the family. The phrase, curious little building. This literally means that this was a strange building, but the connotation is negative, showing that this building was new and interesting to Perry and Dick. And it has a story, which ultimately is the hangings that have happened in this building. The word dark, that literally means the absence of light. And the connotation is negative, showing how this building is a bad place where bad things happen. The hangings. Shaped like a coffin, that phrase, that literally means that it was shaped like a coffin. This building was shaped like a coffin. But this is a simile, which compares the building to a coffin. Coffin means death, so this building is being compared to death. All of these are ultimately showing how dark and gruesome this place was, and Dick and Perry were going here to be hanged. Capote chooses certain diction to enlighten Americans about Middle America, like Holcomb, Kansas. He shows how it is beautiful and also how it is scary and dark. The quote about how it's like a sanctuary, that shows how, just like any other place in the world, this can be a beautiful place. But he also uses the quote about death, the hangings of Perry and Dick, to show how this is also a very scary and dark place, just like any other place in the world. He was trying to, his intended audience were the people of America, and he wanted to enlighten them of what was going on in Middle America, United States of America, such as Holcomb, Kansas. And he used a compare and contrast method of organization to show how life for a provincial person living in, say, Holcomb, Kansas, contrasted from a person living in a city such as New York City. There's not much difference. No matter where you're from, you are still the same person, subject to the same moral laws and codes. Ultimately, the audiences are different. Dostoevsky wrote about the internal struggle of man and the struggle people were having because of the corrupt Russian society. Capote wrote about the enlightenment of America, of Americans who knew nothing about rural America. Crime and Punishment uses informal diction, as Dostoevsky is trying to inform us about the struggles of man and in Russia at the time. In Cold Blood uses formal diction, as Capote is narrating the story of the Clutter murder, trying to inform us about the murders and the way of life in Kansas versus urbanized life. So the quote about symbolism here, the symbol here is the cross. The cross he must bear symbolizes what he has done. What he has done is murdered two people. That's what he has to live with the rest of his life. And he has to bear this suffering for the rest of his life because of Russian society. This shows the tone of how the author is very disappointed. He's disappointed with Russian society and how people feel they have to do these things to get by. They have to experience this type of suffering, and they have to do it together, or else they feel they can't get through it. The author is really disappointed, and he really wants change in Russian society. The author uses a simile comparing Raskolnikov to a man condemned to death. This shows how he felt he had no other way, no other choice in life but to murder this woman. He had to take this risk, this crazy, very low percentage of success rate risk, just because he felt like he had no other way to get by in life. And this shows the tone of the author of how he's so disappointed in Russian society and how it's become so corrupt. Russians such as Sonia and Raskolnikov constantly suffer, and they have to do things that they don't want to, such as Sonia's prostitution and Raskolnikov's murder, just so they can get by, and the author feels this is not okay. I found this quote to be very important because, like I've been saying, Raskolnikov is suffering internally, and this quote shows just how he's constantly second-guessing himself. He doesn't know what is right and wrong. He just is so screwed up with his morality. He doesn't know what to do because, again, it shows the tone of how disappointed this author is with Russian society. Raskolnikov doesn't know what to do because he knows he has to do something he shouldn't. And the author shows how Russian society has pushed him to the brink of his internal conflict, to where he does something like commit a murder because he feels that this is the only way. First quote shows how Raskolnikov was not the first person to think of this. Many people wanted to get an economic gain over killing this woman. They thought of it because apparently it would be so easy. But this shows how the author's tone of disappointment in Russian society is really prevalent, because it wasn't just Raskolnikov. He wasn't the only person thinking of this. Russian society was so corrupt that everybody was trying to find ways of getting ahead in life. The second quote, that talks about how Raskolnikov, he was so torn internally that he felt he had to get something off his chest because of his guilt. And this shows that, yes, Russian society is corrupt, but there is good in that society. They know what they need to do. But Russian society is holding them back from doing the right thing and making them do the wrong thing, like murdering those two women. That Raskolnikov, he murdered those two women because he felt he had no choice. This metaphor shows how Perry did not belong in a courtroom. He was not prepared for what he did. Deep down, he's still a kid. And it's his upbringing that has caused him to act out in anger sometimes. And that anger has caused him to be in this courtroom. So the tone is very sympathetic. Capote feels bad for Perry and his upbringing. He realizes that people are not born truly evil. Perry was not born evil to kill those people. It was his upbringing, his rough starts, his him not being accepted in society as being a half-breed, half Indian, half white. It was America and the American dream that held him back, that he felt he couldn't succeed in life. And Capote realized this. It wasn't his fault that he became the way he did. It was his upbringing. And that's why he sympathizes with him. The imagery in this quote shows how peaceful of a place Holcomb was. And it contrasts with what it became using the method of organization, compare and contrast. It contrasts with how it became so chaotic when Perry and Dick entered Holcomb and murdered the Clutters. Figurative language in my fiction than I did my nonfiction, so I found more figurative language in Crime and Punishment than I did in Cold Blood. I believe the genre affects the use of figurative language because genre, depending on the genre, it's supposed to give off a certain kind of mood that the author is trying to achieve to make you feel. And I believe the use of figurative language really helps reinforce this mood that he's trying to make you feel, he or she is trying to make you feel. And using figurative language really accomplishes that. And you want a certain type of mood depending on your genre. So that's why I believe that a more dramatic, soap opera-ish Crime and Punishment uses more figurative language because it's more dramatic and you want a certain type of like feeling for your reader, whereas a more serious real life book like In Cold Blood uses less figurative language because it's more serious and it's not really trying to be super over dramatic because trying to tell you the facts and what happened, and that goes along with the author's purpose. The author's purpose in this case was, in both books, was to inform about a bigger overall message. Both were meant to shed a light on problems that other people in their country were blind to seeing. The main differences in the purpose of these books are the message behind the books. Dostoevsky talks about the struggle of man internally and the struggles of Russia and how corrupt Russia was at the time. And Capote talks about what actually is happening in parts of America many people have never even heard of. As I've said, Crime and Punishment, very prevalent theme was poverty. And the author often uses these examples of Marxist lens in order to convey his points about poverty. These examples of Marxist lens show you how poverty has affected the people of Russia, and specifically Raskolnikov. It makes people feel less of a person and less humane than other people who have money. It makes them do certain things, like Raskolnikov's sister, who wants to get married for money. In my second quote example, she wants to get married for money because she feels it's her only way out. And that just shows, again, the tone of Crime and Punishment, disappointment. Dostoevsky is very disappointed in Russia and how corrupt it's become to make people have to live a life like this and take these ways out just so they can get by. Dostoevsky also uses the gender criticism, especially with Raskolnikov's sister, as I've mentioned. The gender criticism, that talks about family. Family and the familial relationship. Women have to feel like reliant on men. Men have to be the suppliers in this society, and Raskolnikov's sister feels that she has to marry this man because she needs to get by in life and she can't do it on her own. That's how gender was back then. Women had to be compliant to the man. And this is again tone of disappointment because, and the theme of family, because this is how families were made, and this shows Dostoevsky's disappointment in Russia because he just wants Russia to not be corrupt and be normal, not have to be reliant on certain things to get by, where Raskolnikov, Sonia, Raskolnikov's sister, they all need to be reliant on certain things to get by due to the corrupt civilization of, as I've mentioned before, the method of organization in Cold Blood is compare and contrast. It was the life of the Clutters versus the life of Perry and Dick. Peace versus violence. Sanity versus insanity. Love versus hate. Self-control versus impulsiveness. These are the things that were being compared and contrasted in this book. And it really exemplifies the tone, again, of his sympathy. Capote sympathized with how different these two lives were. He felt bad for Perry and how his life was just awful compared to how great the Clutters were. This is just how America is. People are at the very bottom, and then some people are at the very top. And it's hard to get from the bottom to the top. And some people feel that they have to do certain things to get there, and Perry felt like he had to murder the Clutters. This also shows theme. The theme of poverty. Compare and contrast, the Clutters, they were pretty wealthy. And Perry and Rick, they were very poor. It shows why they had to do what they did. They didn't have to, but if they wanted to be anything of themselves and make their way up there, they felt like they had to murder the Clutters by robbing them.